What if the bloodline of an empire, built on conquest, glory, and ambition, concealed not a legacy of greatness, but a seed of madness so virulent that it would one day plunge the entire Roman world into terror? Imagine being raised among armored giants, hearing battle hymns before lullabies, and watching blood spill as casually as wine at dinner. Welcome to Tales of Mythology, where ancient legends, forgotten horrors, and supernatural wars come to life. If you love exploring the untold side of mythology, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell below so you never miss another legendary story. Music. A man named Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known affectionately by soldiers as Caligula or Little Boots, was handed the reins of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The people rejoiced. After years under the iron-fisted and paranoid Tiberius, this vibrant, charismatic prince seemed to shine like a divine promise. But the gods, it seemed, were in a cruel mood. The very soil that birthed him had long been drenched in blood and betrayal. His great-grandfather was Augustus, the first emperor, a master of manipulation. His grandfather, Tiberius, ruled through fear, and his father, Germanicus, beloved by the legions, died under suspicious circumstances. Many whispered poison. According to Suetonius, Caligula's survival amid such ruthless dynastic politics was no miracle. It was strategy. Tiberius, wary of rivals, saw in Caligula not a threat, but a docile, flamboyant youth. "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people," he reportedly said. Suetonius, the 12 Caesars, unknowingly prophesying the horror to come. From the very beginning, Gaius was marinated in power, violence, and imperial theater. As a child on military campaigns, he marched in tiny armor beside battle-hardened veterans, adored like a mascot. But beneath the affection lay the first signs of conditioning. His concept of normality was warped by the disciplined brutality of Rome's military machine. As he matured, the smiling boy who mimicked soldiers began to reflect their worst tendencies. The deaths of his mother, Agrippina the Elder, and his brothers, executed or starved under imperial paranoia, left a wound far deeper than the Senate ever imagined. When he inherited the throne after Tiberius's death, some say by smothering him, Rome exhaled in relief. The nightmare of one tyrant had ended. Or so they thought. In those first months, Caligula dazzled Rome. He handed out bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, freed prisoners, recalled exiles, and, most astonishingly, made the imperial budget public. The people cheered. Senators bowed with renewed hope. Foreign emissaries saw brilliance. The arenas thundered with applause as exotic beasts clashed in blood-soaked sands and chariots raced through marble stadiums. He rebuilt theaters, temples, and roads. Even the theater of Pompey, once stained with the blood of Julius Caesar, was restored. Rome, for a fleeting moment, sparkled again. But beneath the splendor, there were murmurs. The laughter that erupted from the imperial box during executions lasted too long. His gaze, cold and calculating, seemed to follow the blood as it pooled beneath gladiators' corpses. Cassius Dio noted that Caligula would often wander the empty arena at night, pacing the sands where men had just died, as if communing with the ghosts of the fallen. Cassius Dio, Roman history. And then came the fever. 8 months into his reign, a mysterious illness struck. Some say it was encephalitis. Others claimed temporal lobe epilepsy or even a stroke. Whatever it was, it marked the moment when Rome's golden boy shattered. The public, unaware of what was to come, wept outside the palace gates. They lit candles, prayed to the gods, and some even vowed to sacrifice their lives if the emperor recovered. The irony would soon become unbearable. He recovered, but something vital did not return. His voice had changed, now jagged and unpleasant. His eyes burned with a new intensity. He began speaking of divine voices. Jupiter himself, he claimed, spoke to him. He saw visions invisible to others. These revelations, as he called them, would become the foundation for horrors Rome had never imagined. The man who once merely observed violence began orchestrating it like a composer, scoring a symphony of agony. His sense of cruelty evolved, no longer reactive, but deliberate, planned, and theatrical. Before, he had been indifferent to suffering, now he was obsessed. Tacitus, the ever-measured historian, observed that after the fever, there was no longer a man, but a god with a taste for torment. Tacitus, Annals. He forced his sister Drusilla to leave her husband and live with him as a wife. When she died suddenly in AD 38, he declared her a goddess and forbade mourning rituals. Laughing, dining, or even bathing became capital offenses during her mourning period. The penalty, death. This was no longer a prince. This was a force of terror. From this moment on, Caligula's Rome began to unravel, not through civil war or barbarian invasion, but from the mind of one man who believed he was divine. Senators were made to crawl to his feet. He paraded before them, dressed as Jupiter, or worse, as Venus, mocking Rome's gods and its government simultaneously. He would smile one moment and order an execution the next, often without warning or reason. The palace became a place where breathing too loudly could mean death, where every word, every look, was a test. And the only rule was, Caligula always wins. The foundation had been laid. The child soldier had become a god-king, and the most civilized empire on earth was now a stage for his nightmares. "I am still alive," he once declared, bleeding from dozens of wounds on the day of his death. These words, recorded by Suetonius, echo through history, not as a boast, but a warning, a shadow that lingers, a promise that such madness, once born, never truly dies. The transformation was complete after recovering from his mysterious illness. Caligula's nature, once charismatic, now consumed by something darker, began to dominate every facet of Roman life. What had once been moments of eccentricity turned into terrifying displays of tyranny. He no longer masked his cruelty behind grandeur, it became the centerpiece of his rule. From the imperial palace to the Senate chambers, Rome found itself trapped under the will of a man who believed not just in his right to rule, but in his divine destiny to dominate and destroy at whim. The man the people had once cheered had evolved into a figure of fear. He was now a self-declared god, an untouchable force of vengeance and appetite, accountable to no one, least of all the mortals he governed. Signs of delusion multiplied. Caligula began appearing in public dressed as Roman deities, Jupiter with his thunderbolt, Mars in full armor, and, on more than one occasion, Venus, adorned in silk robes and cosmetics. These were not acts of theater, but declarations. Senators were forced to crawl before him, kissing his feet before being granted permission to speak. Those who hesitated met swift, brutal ends. Properties were seized, families scattered. No warning, no trial. Every room became a stage for humiliation, every interaction a gamble with death. His wrath had no pattern. A facial expression, a poorly timed laugh, or simply an unlucky dream could end a life. According to Cassius Dio, Caligula once executed a senator because the man appeared threatening in a dream, not his own dream, but Caligula's. The imperial court turned into a nightmarish carnival. At grand banquets, once symbols of Roman civility and wealth, debauchery became the norm. Caligula would force his guests to engage in degrading sexual acts for his amusement, watching from a throne-like chair, as if presiding over a grotesque performance. The line between dinner party and orgy disappeared completely. Senators' wives were summoned and raped in front of their husbands. Caligula would return to the table and offer graphic commentary about their bodies and performance, forcing the men to nod and agree or face execution. These acts were not driven by lust alone. They were demonstrations of power, deliberate humiliations meant to strip Rome's elite of every last shred of dignity. His relationship with his sisters crossed every moral line, even by Roman standards. Drusilla, whom he had once forced to live as his wife, was now dead and declared a goddess. But Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla, his remaining sisters, became unwilling instruments in his public and private spectacles. He used them not only for his personal pleasure, but also as political tools, offering them to visiting dignitaries and Roman nobles like trophies. Their status as members of the imperial family no longer offered protection. It made them weapons of control. Suetonius wrote that Caligula treated these women as sacred extensions of himself, forcing them into sexual rituals that blurred the lines between family, religion, and horror. The emperor's obsession with violence extended to the amphitheater, where he elevated public games into spectacles of unrestrained brutality. Gladiators fought not for honor or survival, but to fulfill his increasingly sadistic fantasies. When condemned criminals ran short, he would command that sections of the audience be thrown into the arena. Sometimes, these victims were first sexually violated by trained gladiators before being fed to wild beasts. The amphitheater, once the pride of Roman architecture and public entertainment, now became a chamber of state-sanctioned horror. What the people had once called games were now public executions for his amusement. Caligula turned the suffering of others into an empire-wide performance. He also began redefining the role of the Roman treasury. The enormous surplus left behind by Tiberius, estimated at 2 billion sesterces, was devoured within a year. Games, monuments, temples dedicated to his own divinity, every expense was a tribute to his ego. When funds dwindled, he turned to extortion. The treason trials returned, but unlike under Tiberius, they were now focused solely on financial gain. Wealthy citizens were accused of imaginary offenses, stripped of their property, then executed or exiled. Even silence became taxable. Citizens were required to pay for the privilege of attending his speeches. Speaking too much or not at all could be seen as an offense. Remaining alive under Caligula was expensive and uncertain. Perhaps the most bizarre symbol of his descent into madness came in the form of a horse. Incitatus, his favorite steed, was granted a marble stable, gold-embellished feed troughs, and a retinue of servants. Caligula declared his intention to appoint the horse as consul, Rome's highest civil office. This was no joke. It was a calculated insult to the Senate, a statement that the political elite of Rome were, in his eyes, no more competent than a beast. It was a declaration that mocked tradition, governance, and the very essence of Roman authority. Incitatus did not need to speak. His appointment spoke volumes about how far Rome had fallen. By the second year of Caligula's rule, fear had become the empire's dominant language. The palace transformed into a fortress of paranoia with secret corridors, hidden chambers, and rooms lined with torture devices. He took personal pleasure in describing their function to guests. Iron maidens, racks, thumbscrews, all polished and displayed beside priceless works of art, as if to remind everyone that in his Rome, beauty and horror coexisted, as if to whisper that pain was now as essential as power. Caligula's Rome was no longer a city of laws, but a palace of illusions, where the gods spoke through madness and obedience was the only path to survival. Music. Caligula's delusion of divinity infected every realm he touched, his court, his economy, his sexuality, and even the sacred. What had begun as mere eccentricity now spiraled into a doctrine of blasphemy and degradation. The temples of Rome, once hallowed spaces dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus, were desecrated with statues of the emperor, their faces replaced by his own. Citizens were ordered to bow before these false idols and offer sacrifices, not to gods, but to the man who believed himself their equal. Temples became theaters of imperial narcissism, their altars polluted with forced worship and fear. Failure to perform, men condemned for treason or for simply failing to applaud with enthusiasm were forced to watch their wives and daughters tortured before being executed themselves. Some were made to witness their family suffering over days, kept alive through torture just long enough to feel the full extent of psychological torment. Women who displeased him were not killed swiftly. Instead, they were subjected to prolonged abuse, rape as ritual, pain as performance. Their cries echoed through the marble halls of the palace as grim reminders to the living. The emperor's creativity in cruelty knew no boundaries. Torture became theatrical. Suffering, an art form. Even Rome's executioners grew numb under the weight of his demands. The gladiatorial games under Caligula reached new heights of perversion. He no longer limited the violence to criminals or slaves. Nobles, senators, and equestrians were dragged into the sand, stripped of their garments and dignity, and made to fight while being sexually assaulted by trained gladiators. Some of these victims were educators, poets, and veterans, men who had once served the Republic with honor, now reduced to writhing figures in a blood-soaked arena. When no more condemned men were available, Caligula would point to a section of the crowd and have them seized. On one occasion, recorded by Cassius Dio, dozens of spectators were raped and thrown to the lions simply because their reactions during a match had displeased him. The line between entertainment and massacre vanished entirely. The imperial palace became a house of dread. Every chamber, every hallway could turn into a stage for his mood swings. Servants developed a silent language of hand gestures and facial expressions, desperate to anticipate his rage. But even this system failed often. Caligula's wrath could be ignited by a cough, a glance, or the fabric of a tunic. Executions happened daily. One moment he would joke and flatter a guest. The next, he would order their death and force others to laugh as it happened. The kitchen served not just food, but fear. Suetonius recounts that he once forced a nobleman to dine on what he claimed was human flesh, calling it a delicacy of the gods. Whether it was true or not mattered less than the psychological devastation it caused. As his grip tightened, even his generals and military officers were humiliated. The military, a cornerstone of Roman identity, was transformed into his personal puppet theater. Centurions were stripped naked and made to crawl through mud. Commanders were ordered to run beside his chariot until they collapsed from exhaustion. When Caligula marched on the northern frontier, he did not fight enemies. He gathered seashells on the shore, calling them spoils of war from the ocean. These he paraded through Rome in a mock triumph, declaring victory over Neptune himself. Veterans of true wars were forced to celebrate this absurdity. He wielded humiliation as strategy and satire as punishment. Even the most seasoned officers began to question not only his sanity, but their own. By the 4th year of Caligula's rule, Rome had become a city not of laws or legacies, but of terror. What little remained of political structure was paralyzed by fear. The Senate had been reduced to an audience for the emperor's psychosis, each senator unsure if a simple gesture might cost him his life. The Praetorian Guard, once the sacred shield of imperial power, had become a tool for executing his whims. But beneath their armor, unease was growing. The guards, forced to enforce not just authority, but humiliation, had begun to question their purpose. When loyalty becomes complicity in madness, even soldiers reach a breaking point. And in the heart of this decay, one man stepped forward, not for glory or power, but because the alternative was annihilation. Cassius Chaerea, a veteran centurion of the Praetorian Guard, had endured years of public mockery at Caligula's hands. The emperor had taunted his voice, assigned him obscene passwords, and laughed at his dignity. But behind the humiliation, Chaerea watched and waited. He understood what many feared to admit: Caligula would not stop until Rome was reduced to ashes. In whispers and glances, a conspiracy formed. It was not a rebellion of ideology, but of survival. Senators, knights, servants, men from every level of Roman society joined in secret meetings, driven by the certainty that as long as Caligula lived, no one in Rome would ever be safe again. They did not seek revenge. They sought release from an empire that had become a slaughterhouse disguised as a throne. The final straw came with an announcement during the Palatine Games. Caligula declared he would leave Rome permanently and settle in Alexandria, where he could be worshipped as a living god without interference. But more alarming was his plan to exterminate the Senate entirely. He would replace Rome's ruling class with animals, slaves, and his favorite horse. The Senate laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke. But those closest to Caligula knew better. His madness had become systematic. The warning was clear: one final purge was coming. The conspirators chose their moment carefully. They studied the palace routines, the guard changes, and the emperor's habits. And they found the perfect spot: a narrow corridor beneath the palace where even Caligula's Germanic bodyguards could not protect him in time. On the morning of the assassination, Caligula watched a theatrical performance filled with scenes of betrayal and murder. He seemed amused, unaware that the fiction on stage would soon become his fate. As he exited the theater to return to the palace, he took the shortcut through the underground passage. Waiting in the shadows was Chaerea, flanked by his fellow conspirators. As the emperor entered the corridor, the silence of stone and torchlight swallowed the sound of approaching death. Chaerea stepped forward and struck the first blow, deep into Caligula's jaw and neck. The others followed, stabbing until the body collapsed onto the marble floor, blood spilling from dozens of wounds. Suetonius writes that his last words were chilling: "I am still alive." They were not a plea, but a protest, a man who could not accept that he was no longer a god. What followed was chaos. Word of the assassination spread, but instead of celebration, the Senate panicked. They feared retaliation from the Germanic Guard, who had not been informed of the plot. The city braced for civil war. The conspirators had killed the emperor, but had failed to prepare for succession. Power was a vacuum now, and blood attracts ambition. Then, by chance or fate, Claudius, Caligula's uncle, was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace. Terrified and trembling, he was dragged before the Praetorians. But instead of death, they saw a solution. In a moment of desperation, they declared him emperor. It was not out of loyalty or admiration. It was strategy. The empire needed a name, a body to rally around. And Claudius, unassuming and previously ignored, was suddenly Rome's last hope for stability. Claudius would go on to bring order back to the empire. But the wounds left by Caligula would not heal easily. Statues were toppled, inscriptions defaced. His name was erased from monuments in what would become one of Rome's most deliberate acts of memory obliteration, the damnatio memoriae. The empire had not only executed a tyrant, it had chosen to erase him. But what Rome tried to forget, history could not. Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio all preserved the truth, even if it meant risking their reputations, because they understood something Rome had only begun to grasp. This was not just the story of a mad emperor. It was a revelation of how power, when left unchecked, becomes a disease. Caligula had not simply ruled Rome. He had infected it. His reign exposed the fragility of civilization. The Senate, once proud, had become an audience to depravity. The military, once disciplined, had bowed to insanity. The people, once sovereign in their allegiance, had become spectators to their own subjugation. And all of it happened not through conquest or invasion, but through silence, through complicity, through fear. Caligula's death was not just the end of a tyrant. It was the exorcism of an idea that one man could claim the heavens, command the gods, and make Rome kneel to nothing but his will. To rule over men as if they were cattle, and to slaughter them as if they were sheep, is not the right of an emperor, but the curse of a beast, wrote Tacitus, Annals, Book 6. A quote echoed in every broken statue, every burned scroll, and every silent corner of Rome, where Caligula's name was never spoken again, but never truly forgotten.